This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. Following an extensive investigation, 43-year-old Mike DeBardeleben was arrested in May of 1983. Having been tracked by the Secret Service for nearly 4 years, they'd been following the trail of a serial counterfeiter dubbed the Mall Passer, whose scheme centered around creating his own $20 bills and then using them in malls across America. He would hit up several shops within each mall, purchase small items, and pocket the change, ultimately amassing hundreds of thousands of dollars across most of the continental United States. After his arrest in Tennessee in May of that year, investigators with the Secret Service began looking for proof of DeBardeleben's printing machine, since they weren't sure yet if he was working alone or if he was just a single part of a larger operation. They theorized that he had been working alone, since he had a pretty storied criminal history, which included a prior arrest for counterfeiting. In 1976, he had been arrested after printing a large batch of $100 bills in his own home. His rap sheet also included prior arrest for auto theft, assault, and sexual assault, the details of which I covered on the last couple of episodes. A search of DeBardeleben's home revealed indisputable proof of his counterfeiting operation, but no printing machine. So Secret Service agents continued their quest, eventually uncovering storage units rented out by DeBardeleben under some of the many aliases he had created and kept detailed records of. In one of these storage units, they would eventually find his printing machine, concluding that he alone had been responsible for the entire counterfeit operation. Not only the creation of the bills, but the distribution, which he single-handedly oversaw while traversing the country. But while searching these storage units, they uncovered evidence of additional crimes, a lot of which fell far outside of their scope. Mike DeBardeleben had kept an extensive amount of handwritten notes and even tape cassettes of audio recordings he had made, which detailed not only his monetary crimes, counterfeiting, and various types of fraud, but also physical crimes that he had committed against others, mainly in the form of sexual assault and torture. Over many hours of audio recordings, he had acted out his strange, sadistic fantasies on women, who were sometimes given shorthand nicknames by DeBardeleben. Other times, these women were left unidentified. These poor women were also documented in the form of photographs taken by DeBardeleben in the act. As Secret Service investigators began sifting through this mass amount of evidence, they struggled to determine who exactly these women had been. Some, they assumed, were the prior wives or girlfriends of DeBardeleben. Others, though, remained enigmas. Some still remain unidentified to this day. But based on how these women sounded during the recording of their abuse, they were often not willing participants to it. Fearing that they had stumbled upon something that they were ill-equipped to handle, these members of the Secret Service began reaching out to other investigative bodies for assistance, namely the FBI. But at the time, these agents didn't have much tangible evidence of criminality to work with. Sadly, some audio recordings of what sounded like sexual sadism, along with some accompanying pictures, weren't enough for the FBI to take up the case without names or actual allegations of criminal activity. But that would not deter these agents who believed that Mike DeBardeleben, now languishing in a jail cell awaiting trial for his counterfeiting crimes, could be a repeat offender that had hurt many women over years, potentially even decades. Based on what these Secret Service agents had found, they had begun to theorize that DeBardeleben could have been a serial abductor, rapist, and even a killer. Eventually, a meeting was held between these agents and some higher-ups at the Secret Service. During this meeting, these agents presented the evidence that they had compiled so far, which included some of the audio tapes, which therein contained recordings of Mike DeBardeleben subjecting the women on the other end to not only rough sexual assaults, but other forms of physical torture. They had almost always been bound or tied up, gagged, blindfolded, and were then subjected to having cigars put out on their skin, being beaten, things like that. During this meeting, investigators with the Secret Service were given the green light to continue investigating Mike DeBardeleben, beyond the scope of his financial crimes. Rumor has it that Secret Service Director John Simpson sat in on the meeting and personally okayed the continued investigation after hearing just a snippet of the audio recordings. It was hoped that the victims contained within the photographs and the audio recordings could be identified, and hopefully, if they were still alive, they would be willing to testify against DeBardeleben to ensure that he would remain behind bars for the rest of his life. Afterward, these Secret Service agents set out on an investigation that was unprecedented in the agency's history. Within a few short weeks, they had gone from investigating a serial counterfeiter to looking into one of the most sadistic individuals ever seen by law enforcement. Little did they know what exactly they would uncover. Part 4. Unsub. Now behind bars, 43-year-old Mike DeBardeleben was no longer in control of his future. Having spent the past couple of decades on his own, operating to the beat of his own drum, Mike was now locked up, awaiting trial for the counterfeiting charges that had brought him down. He had spent years brutalizing young women and forcing them to endure his version of agony, but now he was trapped in a hell of his own making, having believed that federal investigators were too slow or caught up in bureaucratic nonsense to ever catch on to his ongoing schemes. And sadly, he might have had a little bit of a point. Were it not for him stealing money from businesses through his mall passer scheme, he'd likely have been able to keep going on with his various sex crimes for an indefinite amount of time. But messing with other people's money, especially the government's, is maybe the only way to ensure justice is served in America. But that's a conversation for another time. After waiving his right to a jury trial, DeBardeleben was found guilty of counterfeiting in August of 1983, but sentencing in that case was deferred pending a background investigation, which had been in the works since before his arrest. At this point, authorities had begun diving into DeBardeleben's chaotic background and learned about not only his prior conviction for counterfeiting, but his past arrest for assault and sexual assault, which again I detailed in the last 2 episodes. But the evidence they had found during searches of DeBardeleben's home and storage lockers revealed a much more shocking truth than they ever expected, that the small handful of charges he had accumulated throughout his life were just a hint of the overall damage he had left behind in his wake. Based on the audio recordings and photographs they'd found, along with various mementos, garments of clothing, pieces of jewelry, or ID cards stolen from dozens of women, investigators feared that there were many more victims of Mike DeBardeleben than they ever knew of. On Labor Day weekend, 1978, a young woman we will refer to as Lucy Alexander went camping with her boyfriend in southwestern Delaware, near the Indian River. That Saturday, September 3rd, Lucy drove with her boyfriend to a local watering hole in order to fully indulge and take advantage of the waning days of summer. They spent hours drinking at Back of the Rack, a bar in nearby Ocean City. As young men and women do whilst drinking, tempers flared, and the two got into an argument later that evening. Just after midnight, Lucy, now intoxicated, began walking back to the campsite without her boyfriend. Maybe she just wasn't aware of how far they actually were from the campsite when she left, but Lucy began walking several miles on foot, making it to nearby Fenwick Island by roughly 1:30 a.m. That was when a vehicle pulled up beside her, which she later recalled being a dark-colored sedan of some make. The driver was a clean-shaven white man with dark hair, who Lucy would later recall as being wimpy-looking. The man offered her a ride, which Lucy rejected, but he insisted after finding out where she was going. He claimed that he was driving right past the Indian River campground. It wasn't a problem. After a few moments of haggling, Lucy gave in to the persistent driver and got into the passenger seat. Once inside, the man asked about her age, claiming that she looked much younger than the 19 that she told him. They then began driving, heading toward the campground where Lucy had been staying with her boyfriend. After getting to the campground, however, the tone changed. The man pulled out what looked like a police badge, claiming that he was an FBI agent and that Lucy was under arrest for hitchhiking. Within a moment, he had handcuffed her wrist behind her, and she was unable to flee the vehicle or put up much of a fight. Already intoxicated, the handcuffs almost completely immobilized her. The man began driving north toward Rehoboth Beach, where he said he was going to book Lucy at a local police station. But once there, he changed his mind, now driving west toward Georgetown, where he claimed the Sussex Correctional Institution awaited. It quickly became clear to Lucy, though, that this was just another ruse. This man had no intention of taking her to any police station. In fact, he was undoubtedly not even a cop. The man drove straight to the nearby countryside, where he then totally dropped the illusion of being an FBI agent or a police official of any kind. There, Lucy was gagged, blindfolded, and then bound, hidden in the back seat of the car underneath a blanket. The man told her she would be safe as long as she listened to him. For the next 2 hours, Lucy was kept underneath the blanket in the back seat, while he, as noted by various newspaper reports and author Stephen Michaud, drank root beer and smoked cigarettes as he drove, punctuated by his frequent belching. After driving for roughly 2 hours, they made it to what sounded like a residential neighborhood, where the car came to a stop. Lucy, still blindfolded and gagged, was then whisked inside into what she presumed was the man's home, where he quickly moved her upstairs into a room where there was little more than a mattress and a blanket. The blindfold was kept in place, but the gag was removed, and what followed was a miserable 18 hours, where Lucy was orally, vaginally, and anally raped multiple times. Her abductor was unable to finish, oftentimes taking upwards of an hour to do so. Throughout the ordeal, he demanded that Lucy refer to him as Daddy, barely able to keep up his small erection without her indulging him in that. When she hesitated or refrained, he threatened to kill her, constantly reminding Lucy that her life was in his hands. On the occasions that he did finish, the man would fall asleep nearby, or would go on long-winded tirades about his ex-wife, who he claimed was spending all of his money. The hours blended together, and Lucy wasn't sure whether or not she would ever be free of this hell. But at one point, the man dressed her, took her back downstairs, and guided her into the backseat of the car, where she had a blanket thrown over her yet again. The man began driving as he had beforehand, at one point telling Lucy that if he was stopped by a cop, he would be forced to shoot and kill not only the officer, but her. Thankfully though, Lucy was released at about 2:30 a.m. on September 5th, roughly 5 miles away from Georgetown, Delaware, in a rural area known as Hardscrabble. She was picked up by a Delaware state trooper just moments later as her abductor sped off down the road toward parts unknown. Just months later, on Memorial Day weekend 1979, a 20-year-old woman we'll call Lori Jensen was closing up shop at a convenience store in Ocean City, Maryland. She had taken on the job managing the shop that summer, and began walking home at around midnight on June 1st, 1979, a path that she had taken many times before. Moments later, Lori was apprehended by a man driving a dark blue sedan, who pulled up beside her and immediately flashed a badge. The man told Lori that he was a police officer and demanded she get into the vehicle. She did so with little reluctance. Once she was in the vehicle, the man claimed that Lori was a suspect in a local robbery and began asking her a couple of questions as he drove her around. Before long, he told her that she was under arrest for robbery and burglary, and he quickly handcuffed Lori. From here, the abduction proceeded almost exactly as the abduction of Lucy Alexander had the year prior, with the man driving north for a bit, then west, claiming to change his mind on where to take her in for the robbery charge. Howard County Detective Richard Witta would later write in his report on the incident. At this time, the victim claims that she realized that the subject was probably not a police officer. She opened the door, got both feet on the ground, screamed, and tried to get away. Suspect grabbed her and said, "I'll kill you." He then put handcuffs on her ankles, bunched up her hair behind her head, took a rubber band and tied it in a ponytail, and then took white adhesive tape and began taping her face, going down across her face behind her neck, around her face again numerous times. He then taped above her eyes, down under her chin. The victim was struggling at this time, very scared. The suspect said, "Cool it. Didn't anybody ever tell you what to do in case something like this happened to you? You're defenseless. Don't even struggle. There's nothing you can do." The suspect at this time pushed her on the floor with her head resting against the bucket seat facing the door. The suspect said, "I have a gun and I'll use it. I have nothing to lose because I've already kidnapped you." Like the abduction of Lucy Alexander, this one began with a roughly 2-hour-long drive, with Lori subjected to the floor in the backseat of her abductor's vehicle, and resulted in her being hurried off into an upstairs bedroom in a residential neighborhood. As she was brought into the bedroom, she noted what sounded like a loud buzzer when the door to the room was opened, likely something recently installed by the abductor. Inside, Lori refused to undress herself, but her abductor did it for her, and then began subjecting her to various sex acts. Like before, he had difficulty maintaining an erection or achieving orgasm, but insisted on being called Daddy throughout. Like Lucy, Lori recalled the offender's penis being rather small. As he had done with some of his other victims, the offender demanded Lori beg for additional pain. To him, hearing it vocalized seemed to be one of his favorite parts. After being raped, Lori was kept locked in a 3-foot by 6-foot bedroom closet where her handcuffs were chained to an eye bolt on the floor. There she was kept naked and blindfolded for several hours before her abductor returned for another session of torment. This repeated a couple of times, with the abductor even using some large sex toys during the act, and making mementos of their encounter. Not only photographs taken in the midst of the various rapes, but also audio recordings, during which the abductor could be heard calling Lori Becky, a name he had seemingly imagined for her. During this recording, as reported by author Stephen Michaud in his book Lethal Shadow, the abductor told Lori, "I'll tell you what's going down. I had an ex-old lady who really pissed me off and fucked me over. I just want to get back at women." Roughly 24 hours after being abducted, the man returned to Lori's room and let her get dressed. Afterward, he drove her back to Maryland, dropping her off just a couple of blocks away from her family's home on June 3rd, but not before telling Lori that if she went to police, he would release the photos and audio recordings he had made of her in her worst moments, which wouldn't soon be forgotten. When Lucy Alexander had been abducted and raped in 1978, authorities believed it might have been a one-time thing. Perhaps she had even been attacked by a traveling offender from out of the area, who stumbled upon her through mere happenstance. Investigators struggled to make any inroads in the case based off of the scant information they could glean from Lucy and the crime scene, but they were on the lookout for any similar cases that unfolded nearby. When Lori Jensen was similarly abducted and sexually assaulted just months later, in 1979, it became clear to authorities that the two cases were linked. Yet, they still had a hard time trying to track down any suspects. During the two abductions, the offender had done a pretty good job of covering up his tracks. He had clearly abducted the two women in areas that he did not live in, driving them roughly 2 hours away to an unknown residential area. Yet, he'd still felt comfortable enough abducting them in this area, alluding to him being perhaps a frequent traveler that knew it well. He had abducted the two women at night, when it was hard for them to get a clear look of him or his vehicle. No witnesses had been around for either abduction, and it was not believed that the abductor had a previous connection to either of the victims. Rather, this had been a stranger who committed two crimes of opportunity, yet was methodical in how he did so. He also likely lived alone in his house, or had long periods of time without roommates or family. Yet, based on the similarities, investigators immediately believed these two cases were linked. And if that was the case, then there were likely other victims, with the offender's MO probably being shaped through time. A little over a month after the kidnapping and rape of Lori Jensen, FBI officials began searching for the suspect in Ocean City, Maryland, believing that he might strike again that 4th of July weekend. They'd even had undercover agents similar in appearance to the two victims walk along the street in revealing clothing, to no avail. Later that year, investigators turned to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which at the time was still in its relative infancy. There, famed profiler John Douglas himself took a look at the two cases, and in his analysis determined that both were almost undoubtedly linked. In his report, he wrote, "Generally, subjects involved in criminal offenses such as this were raised by a domineering, overbearing mother, and a father who was passive, weak, and indifferent when expressing his feelings to his son and other members of his family. By puberty, he has already been involved in criminal offenses and in all probability has been confronted by local police agencies. His arrest record will reflect offenses including voyeuristic activities, burglary, and assault. While he was attending elementary and secondary schools, he was a problem in the classroom and in all probability was expelled on numerous occasions." Douglas believed that this unknown subject, the Unsub, had enlisted in the military after being expelled, and that while his discharge from the military might have been honorable, there would have been major problems on his part in adjusting to the military way of life. In the profile put together by Douglas and the rest of the Behavioral Sciences Unit, your subject has had a problem throughout his life in adjusting to females and heterosexual relations in general. Your subject can be classified as a sexual experimenter who, by his own inadequacies, believes his assaults upon his victims are desired by them. Much of his warped thinking comes from pornographic literature, which he is obsessed in reading and buying. The pornographic literature that is most appealing to his sexual fantasies are those magazines depicting sadomasochistic types of behavior that reflects total domination and degradation of the female by the male. Although your offender can be classified as being sexually inadequate, it is not surprising to find offenders such as yours either married or recently divorced. Interviews of former spouses generally will reflect a stressful marriage, a marriage that included sexual experimentation and degradation of his own wife. After Mike DeBardeleben was arrested, authorities set out to identify the many victims he had documented in the various photographs and cassette tapes found in his possession. One of these women, identified as Becky in both the photographs and the tapes, was identified during this period as his counterfeiting trial took place. If you recall, Becky had actually been Lori Jensen, which is itself a pseudonym to protect her real identity. She had been abducted and raped in June of 1979 in Ocean City, Maryland, and then driven roughly 2 hours to her abductor's home. Based on the circumstances, authorities believed that Mike DeBardeleben had been this offender, having taken Lori back to his home in Virginia, where he then carried out the crime, before driving her back. After DeBardeleben's arrest in 1983, Secret Service agents brought in Lori Jensen and hoped she would be able to identify DeBardeleben as her abductor. Sadly, because of the circumstances of her abduction, she was unable to do so with great clarity. But she was able to identify herself as the woman being assaulted in the photographs found in DeBardeleben's possession, and was able to clearly make out her voice as the one being recorded on the cassette tape bearing the name Becky. She was also able to provide details about her abductor that insinuated it was DeBardeleben, recalling that her offender had pimples on the right side of his neck, which Mike DeBardeleben did. And she also remembered him wearing a pinky ring on his right hand, which was made of gold and had a black stone set in the middle. That ring was identical to the one that DeBardeleben wore at the time of his arrest, which was now in police custody. This information was presented to Judge Robert Taylor, who at the time was presiding over DeBardeleben's counterfeiting trial. The morning that Judge Taylor was set to hand down his sentence for those crimes, he was brought into a meeting with U.S. Attorney Charles Fells and presented with evidence obtained by the Secret Service over the preceding months. Evidence that included the audio recordings that DeBardeleben had made, laden with torture and rape. Later that day, Judge Taylor would proclaim the suspect of having one of the worst records that's ever been presented in this court, and sentenced him to the maximum allowed under the law, 20 years in prison for counterfeiting. This hard work by the Secret Service to quickly identify some of DeBardeleben's victims had ensured that he would spend years behind bars, but now justice had to be served for the rest of the victims. All of them, even those that remained unidentified. That's after the break. As federal authorities attempted to build their ongoing case against Mike DeBardeleben, a case that grew more insurmountable by the day, they realized that he had been quite adept at keeping himself anonymous. His usage of aliases had ensured that very few people he interacted with ever knew his real name, and his appearance, that of a milquetoast white man entering middle age, did most of the heavy lifting. In most of the photographs he had taken of his various assaults, he had developed the photos himself in order to crop out identifying characteristics. In very few were his face ever visible. He had also gone to great lengths to ensure that his hands, and some other defining characteristics, remained out of the photographs. So investigators had to use more obscure methods to try and link him to the photos, focusing in on other identifiers like moles or freckles. For that, they had to subject him to various nude photographs while in police custody, with DeBardeleben forced to undress and pose for federal investigators. They subjected him to the type of photographs he had taken of several women over many years, telling him which poses to strike and angles to get into in order to get clarifying details of his various nooks and crannies. It's almost hard not to chuckle at the irony. DeBardeleben was also forced to give up samples of his hair, fingerprints, handwriting, and voice to match up with other various forms of evidence. During his incarceration, authorities learned that DeBardeleben had carefully studied other offenders in the past, namely serial killers. Detectives had found an old copy of a Dean Corll book in his childhood home, full of notes that he had made during his reading of it. And in prison, he kept a book about Ted Bundy amongst his possessions. This information about him having a book on Bundy was used by a police officer in Bossier City, Louisiana, of all places, who had a vested interest in learning more about Mike DeBardeleben. While the convicted counterfeiter now sat in jail, awaiting additional crimes, this detective came in to interview him about an open case from his city, an unsolved homicide from about a year prior. In the spring of 1982, Gene McFall was a 40-year-old realtor living in Shreveport, Louisiana. Originally from Alabama, Gene had relocated to Louisiana as a teen with her family, and had lived in the Shreveport area ever since. Having been married for some time, Gene had divorced her husband about a year beforehand, in 1981, but still remained close with her daughter, who had since given birth to a daughter of her own, making Gene a pretty young grandmother at 40. Gene worked for Norman's Realty of Bossier City, located across the Red River from Shreveport. She had worked there for approximately 5 years and managed the Barksdale branch of the real estate firm. One colleague described her as very reliable, very responsible, and very cautious, and another, as reported by the Times, described her as attractive and personable. On Tuesday, April 27, 1982, Gene met with a client who had made an appointment that morning to view a home. This man had actually called her office early that morning, just after 8:30, and requested a tour from her specifically. She told her colleagues that she was planning to meet this client, a doctor from Texas, at the nearby Sheraton Motor Hotel, and then show him a couple of homes nearby. At around 9 a.m., Gene left her real estate office, headed for the Sheraton to pick up this client, who she would refer to as Dr. Zach. A short time later, at around 10:30 a.m., she showed up at the Green Acres Place Development sales office with this client, who waited outside in the passenger seat of her car. Gene signed in at the office and told the workers there that she planned to show him the home at 424 Highland Drive, one of the new homes built in this upper-scale housing development. One of the women who worked inside the sales office later told reporters with the Times, "I didn't get a good look at him. I don't see well at distances. He waited outside by the car, about 25 yards away from me. I couldn't tell what he looked like, except that he was neat and the shirt was light." While inside the sales office, Gene chatted with the other woman, who recalled. She was excited and said his name was Dr. Zach. She said he was a doctor from Midland, Texas, and was moving here in 3 weeks and needed a house. Dr. Zach, Gene dished, was reportedly willing to pay cash, a huge plus for any home sale. Up to this point, things seemed to be progressing smoothly. But a few hours later, Gene's co-workers began to grow worried when she did not check in with them. That was very much not like her. She never disappeared like that without giving notice. Her co-workers would immediately try and retrace her steps. They began searching for her, beginning at the Sheraton Motor Hotel, where they found her unlocked car sitting in the parking lot just before 4 p.m. They then began checking in at the homes she had likely showed Dr. Zach, but they similarly failed to find any trace of her. Hours continued to pass, and Gene McFall didn't surface. Police were eventually informed of her disappearance, and they then began documenting what they found. They made note of her unlocked white 1980 Pontiac Phoenix parked at the Sheraton Motor Hotel, unmoved since Gene's employers had located it on the afternoon of her disappearance. Eventually, officers would begin retracing Gene's steps, searching the homes she had planned to show this mysterious client. The next day, Wednesday, they made their way to the Green Acres Place development, where Gene had checked in the prior morning but failed to check out. While searching the home she had planned on showing, they became aware of maybe checking the attic when they found insulation from within it inside the home, prompting them to pull down the pull-down stairway and climb up to the attic itself. There, hidden behind some air conditioning ductwork, they found the body of Gene McFall at around 1:45 p.m. Immediately after the discovery, police were pretty tight-lipped about what they had uncovered. Lieutenant Scott Henderson, the head of detectives for Bossier City, told reporters, "There were no signs of a major struggle, but how or why it happened, we don't know." As the days passed, however, details began to emerge, and it became clear that this was no routine murder case. This was something far beyond what detectives in Bossier City had seen before. Jean McFall's body had been found hanging from a piece of cloth tied around a piece of roof support in the attic, but she had also been stabbed twice in the chest with a large knife. One wound penetrated her lung, and the other pierced her breastbone, going through both her heart and spine. Both wounds were believed to have required a substantial amount of strength, so they weren't accidental or light in any way. This had been a very deliberate and quick death. Authorities did not know whether Jean had gone up to the attic willingly, perhaps in an attempt to show it to the client, or if she had somehow been lured up there. But the lack of any kind of struggle perturbed and confused the detectives trying to make sense of the crime and the scene. Dr. George McCormick, the Bossier coroner, told reporters, "It is my opinion she was stabbed after she had been strangled and tied up. She had slumped against the noose, a form of hanging. She had slumped against the knot so her feet were touching the floor. She was not dangling." Surprisingly, Jean McFall had not been sexually assaulted in any way, but that almost made the circumstances even murkier. Despite her purse missing from the scene, she was still wearing all of her jewelry, so robbery was not believed to have played a part in the motive either. These details, along with the posing of the body, confused investigators. Per Dr. McCormick, "It is not the typical crime of passion where there is an overkill with a number of wounds. We don't see that in this case. Now, whether that means it was planned and premeditated, I can't say, but it was certainly methodical." As I mentioned, there was no sign of a struggle at the crime scene, which was surprising in and of itself, and it seemed to police that where Jean's body was found was where she had been killed. They estimated that her time of death had been shortly after she arrived at the home, approximately 11 a.m. on Tuesday, April 27, 1982. Dr. McCormick told the media, "There was very little struggle there where she was found, so I think she was, if not unconscious immediately, certainly soon from the strangulation." Unable to glean much from the crime scene, investigators began to focus in on other details from their ongoing investigation, such as the Dr. Zach name used by Jean and presumably the suspect. They believed that this was undoubtedly a fictitious pseudonym, but this man had called Norman's Realty at around 8:30 on the day of the murder and asked for Jean specifically, indicating to authorities that he saw advertisements for her in the local paper. For that reason, he might not have been a local, but he possibly traveled through the area and had seen these ads during some of his prior visits, filing away knowledge of them for later use. He had also likely targeted Jean specifically. Investigators would learn that despite his best efforts, this man had been seen by at least a few people, including the worker at the Green Acres sale facility, who, per her own admission, had trouble seeing him from afar, but also from some of the neighbors near the home where Jean McFall had been killed. Police officials put together their combined descriptions to make a profile and sketch of the suspect, believed to be a white man, about 40 years old, who stood about 6 feet tall and weighed somewhere between 160 to 180 pounds with a slim build. He also had light-colored curly hair, slender facial features, and was wearing business casual clothing at the time of the crime. After murdering Jean McFall in the attic of this home, this individual had likely driven her car back to the Sheraton, where it remained for roughly 24 hours. Her co-workers had found it there in the parking lot on the afternoon of April 27th, just hours after the presumed murder, but it remained untouched until 5 o'clock the following morning when police found it again. Back at the crime scene, scant details were found, and no murder weapon was ever recovered. The offender had evidently done a good job of covering his tracks, and the leads were painstakingly slow to develop. Most were quickly eliminated, to the chagrin of investigators. Weeks after the murder, in mid-May 1982, a composite sketch of the suspect was finally released, along with a more detailed description agreed upon by the witnesses that saw him. He was believed to be a white man between 35 and 40 years old, who stood around 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighed between 150 to 160 pounds, had short hair that was either gray or graying, had a light complexion, a slim build, and was neatly dressed in slacks and a sports shirt. Chief of Detectives Scott Henderson stated, "The man was very careful not to be seen, and he accomplished what he was after." During his interview with detectives from Bossier City, Louisiana, Mike DeBardeleben insisted that Ted Bundy wasn't as smart as he thought he had been, which might have been one of the truest things that Mike DeBardeleben ever said. Bundy thrived in an era where a mediocre white man could get away with just about anything, and got through his various criminal acts with an awful lot of luck. DeBardeleben claimed that Bundy had made a lot of mistakes, and that he was much smarter than Bundy had ever been. Yet, maybe unbeknownst to him at the time, investigators had started to narrow in on him for specific crimes. During their interrogation, these detectives played into DeBardeleben's belief that he was smarter than not only Ted Bundy, but themselves. They were, after all, just some detectives from Bossier City, Louisiana, and they played up the assumption that they were just a couple of dumb hicks. They let DeBardeleben believe that the Secret Service was just errantly barking up trees, and they hyped up his intelligence as being above theirs. Little did he know, though, that authorities had reason to suspect him of involvement in Jean McFall's murder. You see, at this point, investigators had started tracing his Malpasser crimes, not only geographically, but charting a timeline, showing where he had been and when. Detectives had actually started to link the previously unidentified Malpasser to Jean McFall's murder before Mike DeBardeleben had even been arrested, not only because the timelines matched up so well, but because the descriptions of the two were nearly identical. Only after Mike DeBardeleben's arrest did police learn that the serial counterfeiter was actually a deviant in so many other ways. Not only was he very likely a serial rapist, but they now believed he may have been a killer. Coincidentally, Mike DeBardeleben had been in the area of Bossier City when Jean McFall was killed, and her death was incredibly similar to that of Terry McDonald, whose story I covered in the introduction of the last episode. She was a real estate agent who was killed in nearly identical circumstances in Barrington, Rhode Island, having been lured to a home with a prospective male client using a fake name, in that case, Peter Morgan, and then strangled to death. Her body was found hanging in the basement of the home she had been showing this client, posed in a similar way to Jean McFall. Surprisingly, though, that crime predated Jean McFall's murder by over a decade, having taken place in April of 1971. For that reason, it was possible that Terry McDonald's murder had been the first, but it was unlikely to have been the only one connected to Mike DeBardeleben. Once the primary method of financing and documenting his crime spree, Mike DeBardeleben's intricate note-taking was proving to be his undoing, with investigators using not only his extensive financial crimes, counterfeiting and bank fraud, but his extensive collection of notes to chart where he had been and what he had been up to. In some cases, he had been just a few miles away from the various crime scenes on the days either before or after they took place. And now, with witnesses beginning to identify him as the offender, the future looked pretty bleak for DeBardeleben, who was already looking at decades behind bars. To make matters even more damning, among his copious notes, investigators found the alias Dr. Zach, the very same used by the killer of Jean McFall. Over the next several months, investigators would work on building an even more comprehensive case, timeline, and profile of this serial offender, not only to ensure that justice was served, but so this man, who had dedicated his life to crime and hurting others, would die behind bars. That's on the next episode of Unresolved. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Unresolved. I am your host, Michael Whelan. This episode was researched, written, and produced by myself. I also put together the music heard throughout the episode, except where noted in the show notes. The amazing producers of the show, who support the show each month on Patreon, are Roberta Jansen, Sarah Moscaratolo, Brandy Nordine, Jacinta Klass, Alex Kalaragopoulos, Scott Meesey, Ben Crocum, Patrick Loxo, Marion Welsh, Lauren Nicole, Sally Ranford, Riddis Baugh, James Weiss, Stephen Diaz, Derek Smith, Heather Fiddler, Crystal J, and Zach Cass. Thank you all for your continued support. It really does keep this show alive. I would also like to thank the rest of the patrons who support the show each month on Patreon. You can become a producer or a patron by heading to patreon.com/unresolvedpod, where you can get access to commercial-free episodes, our entire archive of bonus episodes, and every episode of the Patreon exclusive show, Resolved. There I take a look at solved cases, such as the conviction of As I Lay Dying frontman Tim Lambesis, or a group of teen killers who thought they were vampires. I also cover unique short stories like The Cape Intruder, a young man who broke into houses in the Cape Cod area and watched people sleep. All of that and more is only available on the Patreon. If you would like this show to keep going, please continue to spread word of it with your friends, family, or anywhere else you think of. Reddit, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, even TikTok. I also do appreciate your reviews. The powers that be changed how podcast metrics are calculated last year, and it's wreaked havoc on the industry as a whole. That's why a lot of shows have either quit or been canceled lately. But those reviews you give are still incredibly valuable. I appreciate each one. They really do help keep this show alive. So keep them coming. I'm hoping I'll be able to start bringing this story to a conclusion in the next episode. But until then, I hope you all stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you all later.